I remember when I was 8 years old being confused with the concept of visiting your grandparents. I always wondered, why don't you live with your grandparents? I do. Basically, the way it worked was my grandmother, my Gigi, bought a house for her mother to take care of her out in the suburbs. But she ended up passing away, and Gigi offered to let my parents live in the house until they found a new place, which they did for 21 years, 19 of which I spent there. So I was living with my Gigi, my pop-up, my mom, my dad, occasionally my Uncle Matt. But oftentimes I would come home from school and my Gigi would be prepping some dinner, and she'd ask me to sit down with her, snap the string beans, sort through lentils and rice, make sure to pick out all the little stones and pieces of rice and pieces of bad rice or twigs. We were a family that appreciated our food. We were the kind of people who would just hunt for gristles in the meat before cutting them and prepping them and serving them to anyone else. And ultimately, Gigi was the one who really got me into cooking. And that was because she made really amazing food. She made some really good stuff like red beans and rice, beef stroganoff, beef stew, mashed potatoes, but the holy grail was her polenta. Basically, imagine lasagna, but in the place of those flat pieces of pasta, just imagine a huge slab of cornmeal, completely soaked with tomatoes and cheese and sausages. You just lay down a layer of cornmeal, and then some gravy, and then some sausage, and then cheese, and then another slab of cornmeal, and cheese, and sausage, and gravy. You'd put it in the oven, and then you'd repeat the whole thing in a completely new casserole dish. And I always wanted to have that polenta, but it took all day to make. You already know how it's made, but actually making the cornmeal itself takes about 3 hours out of your day. Just mixing it with the milk and the water and making sure it boils properly without getting stuck to the sides of the pot. So Gigi cut a deal with me. I could have the polenta if I learned how to make it. And the first few times, I didn't think to write down the recipe, partially because she always knew how to cook it, and I always thought she'd be around and that I'd never leave the house, honestly. But July of 2011, she had to go to the hospital. She stayed there for a couple of days. She got some tests done. Eventually, she decided she was done with the hospital. She wanted to go back home. And she did, and I was determined to show her that I could make polenta by herself if anything ever happened. So the first thing I did was I went up to her and I asked her for the recipe, and then I wrote it down. I double-checked it to make sure everything was right because I actually remember writing down that I needed 10 pounds of sausage for one recipe. I called up my best friend, another polenta fan. We called up the rest of the family, my mom, my dad, aunts, uncles, various relatives, girlfriends, distant cousins I hadn't seen in months, invited them together for one big dinner. They were hanging out downstairs. I was making the polenta. I went up to the room, and she's in the bed. My dad's taking care of her. I asked, "Hey, Gigi, I'm making polenta. Do you want just plain stuff, or do you want it fried with the sausage and the gravy?" Dad said plain. She said fried. Several hours later, we make the polenta. Everyone at the table said it was the best they ever made, the best they ever ate. I bring some up to my Gigi, and She didn't eat any of it, but she was so glad to hear that everybody else did. And the next day, she wasn't around, and I ended up going to her wake, going to her funeral, being her pallbearer. And throughout all that, I was just thinking of the polenta I made for her, the meal I made for her, the meal she taught me that she got to eat in her home.